Okay, you want to start?
So I have two questions, and then that's all I have tonight. The first one is, Yitzchak and Avraham were both tested at the binding. There's some hints that, I don't know if you could say his test was harder, but that his test was significant. Could Avraham have succeeded, Yitzchak have failed, and then Yitzchak would have died, or have had to have died? What would that have meant for the Jewish people? And Yitzchak, if this could happen, why would that, what was the test for him? Presumably he knows Hashem is there, that he's sort of the one who runs the universe. Why would it be difficult for him to sacrifice his life considering the madrega he was on?
Okay, I'm not sure there are two or three different questions there, so I'm not.
So I think
I'm not hearing a coherent picture.
So we'll start with the first one. If he failed, could he have died there? Avraham have killed him. Avraham succeed, and Yitzchak have failed. Was that a possibility there?
Could they have failed? Of course it could have failed. It was a whole question of free choice. But I don't know what failing would have to do with dying. I would assume failing would mean he'd run away and live. What would failing mean?
Well, failing would mean that he makes it part of the way, that it's not just about sitting there, and accepting things, but also about having the right kavanah at that moment, that his internal reality was not appropriate to live, potentially. And then in that case...
I understand. The design of the event was that he was supposed to die. Had it issued in his death, that could have been the greatest success. I don't see what failure has to do with dying. I don't see the connection between the two of them. Failure would mean he was commanded to accept the fact that he had to die. So to fail at that would mean to run away, protest, try to resist. That would be failure.
That would be a full failure. But a partial failure would have been that he didn't accept his death in the proper way. And then that would have necessitated that he would have died, but he would have received partial.
Why? What's one thing got to do with the other? If he had the wrong kavanah, then God would have called it off and done it with somebody else. Why? What has the fact that he has the wrong intention or wrong understanding of what he's doing got to do with necessitating he has to die?
Because there's a hidden idea in the background, which I'm not probably bringing, which is that Yitzchak before the binding wasn't appropriate to be like a future leader of the Jewish people, or it wasn't appropriate to be that link in the chain. And so...
Why would you think that? I don't know. You're putting in all sorts of things that have no foundation as far as I'm concerned. Hara, God's plan was that he shouldn't die, and that he should be there. So it wasn't that he wasn't appropriate for the Jewish people.
All right, never mind. Question?
There are too many hidden assumptions that you're using to make your question work, which don't have any foundation. It's not that I don't call that a solid question.
Question scrapped.
But the last thing that you asked was.
What would that have meant for the Jewish people if he sort of died?
Yeah. Let me just point out, just as a little piece of general background. We talk about things that happen, so I can roughly divide things into three different dimensions. One is what happened. Number two, what affected what? What kind of interactions were there between the things that happened? And the third is, if something had happened differently, what would have been the results? When historians discuss what happened, there are sometimes differences of opinion. When they talk about what affected what, there's quite substantial difference of opinion. What were the causes of the American Revolution or the American Civil War? These are disagreements among historians to this day. You ask, if this had happened differently, what would how would the outcome have been different? That's way off the table. When you do that in normal life, you do it by virtue of knowing laws. I had sugar in my pantry, and there was a fire, and the sugar burned up. I say, if it hadn't burned up, I put it in my tea, it would have made my tea sweet. How do I know that? It burned up. So because I have lots and lots of experience with other things, I know about the dissociation of the molecules, I know about the fusion of molecules, so I know a lot about the laws that make these things work. It's very, very difficult to say, the laws of history. Now, that means the only case that we could possibly say is if God revealed to us, well, if this hadn't had this, then this was the alternative, and he would have made it happen. But short of that, you're not going to have any information about things like that at all.
So God gives promises. So he promised to Abraham that he would have offspring as many as the stars, and that he would have that. So we can at least narrow the range in this counterfactual and say that Abraham would have had to have another child by some means.
Well, not really, because we have a rule about God's promises, so to speak, or statements about the future, that all of them are conditional, except,
The good ones.
no, good try, but it's not correct, except the ones which are promises or statements about future benefits, where the prophet communicates the benefit to somebody else for whom it's designed. So when God makes promises, well, it says to Jacob, I'll take care of you, and so forth and so on. And later on, he says, please save me from Esau. And the things that God has said is going to happen haven't happened yet. So Chazal says, maybe my performance has been unworthy of receiving those predictions, and I won't get them, even though they were predicted, because they were made. The statements were made to me about me. The only one, the Rambam says this in to his Mishnah Torah, the only one that's absolute is where God says to Prophet A that someone else or some other group is going to enjoy a benefit. Those are the ones that are meant to be absolute, and the Rambam points out that if you don't have any that are absolute, you can never test a prophet to see whether he was genuine or not. Because if he fails the test, you could always say God didn't mean it as an absolute prediction, or he changed his mind, or whatever it is. You don't say he changed his mind, but the circumstances changed, right? Statements about future punishments are always conditional. They're always conditional on not meriting a turnaround. So certainly what's said to a person about person himself is conditional. It's not meant as an absolute prediction of what's going to happen. So then you have to build in, well, he said that, so then this has to happen, so this has to happen, that has to happen also, and then you're building a house of cards. It's just not, it's not going to work.
All right. The other question is, normally when let's say we accept that the apparent reality, the apparent case that we live in is that Hashem exists, right? That the Jewish people's survival is a miracle, and that all that is so. Someone now wants to come along and tell you it's a simulation, right? Someone ran it to be precisely this. That was their intention the whole time. Fine, I grant you all the phenomena are real, coherent, they're binding together, but that was someone's design. What's our best argument to sort of deflect that as either incoherent or unlikely?
You're talking about these people who talk about that the whole of our reality is really a simulation on a computer. You're talking about that stuff?
I think I want to take all of those hypothetical questions that keep coming up in this that seem silly together, like aliens, simulation, whatever. I want to take all of them and kind of pile them into one and just say, why is that incoherent? Why does that not work?
Well, I don't think you can do that. I mean, there are different questions would need a different approach. But the first thing to say is I only take a proposition seriously if there's positive evidence that it's right. Mm-hmm. Don't demand that I should prove it's wrong. Show me why I should take it seriously because you have some evidence that it's right. Why isn't it this? How do you avoid that? What's wrong with? Don't accept those invitations. I say, you tell me what positive evidence you have, and I'll deal with that in terms of the evidence that I have from my point of view, and we can assess the relative strength of the evidence. But simply that I should rule out every possible alternative, so your contribution to the discussion is your imagination. Maybe it's E.T. Show me it isn't E.T. No, thank you. Go have a cup of coffee. Leave me alone. Right? Show me your evidence that it is E.T. Then I'll deal with that evidence. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that some of them have been shown to be incoherent. Now, what is her name? I think her last name is Hassenfelder. What's her first name? I looked at her stuff in a while. She's a physicist, a research physicist, who also is interested in foundations of physics. She has a blog in which she publishes articles. I have a number of them on my blog, which I reproduced there. And she talks about the metaverse hypothesis. And what you have to imagine But it's not that there's a computer that programs what happens, but a computer that programs all the possible alternatives to what happens. And that would require a computer bigger than the whole universe. For everything that, for example, if you may not believe in free will, but you do believe in quantum mechanics. And in quantum mechanics, there are certain things which could happen one way or another way. And then they can trigger macroscopic effects, and then you'd have to have an unlimited number of different futures for the world, all of which have to be programmed in the beginning because you don't know how this event's going to take place. And that would require a computer bigger than the universe. That's one reason to think that that's not a serious alternative. But then, so sometimes you can prove, but that's specifically about the metaverse, being programmed into a computer simulation, right? That's not going to be ET, and it's not going to be. Each one is going to have its own difficulties.
That's still nice because that's the thing that so many people presume themselves to be that they bring up, and yet if there's a fatal flaw in that, that's kind of wonderful. So.
Yeah, it is, and I think that somebody thinks of something on January 16th, and on January 20th they want to know, prove it's not true. So, first of all, have a couple of cups of coffee and take a vacation in the Alps, and relax. It takes time for a new thought to be understood. Did you really mean this? It seems that you meant that, but then you have a contradiction here. There's a group discussion of it, an international group discussion of it. The idea gets refined over time, and then, and sometimes it just fails at the outset. And then you have spectacular new results. I'm very old. I remember 20 years ago when they discovered that the universe's expansion is accelerating instead of decelerating. Man, that wasn't supposed to happen. That's not part of the Big Bang. That's, a Big Bang is something that triggered an expansion and then been slowing down because of gravity. It gets slower and slower. And then something like supposedly 7 or 8 billion years ago, it started to accelerate. But that's what's called dark energy. Dark energy is some new stuff that makes it accelerate, which is something like 75% of the whole universe is this unknown dark stuff. And then there's dark matter, which is another 25%. And what we're dealing with in our science is about 5% of the total. The other 95% we just don't know anything about. That's how well we understand the universe. Yeah, thanks a lot. So, but nobody expected that. Nobody predicted that. In fact, when the first laboratory reported it, they said it can't be. And when the second laboratory reported it, they said, no, you're both wrong. When the third laboratory reported it, they're completely independent laboratories, they all reported it, then they said, wow, something new is going on, So why should I struggle to deal with the old one when the expected lifespan of these ideas is 20 or 30 years, and it's going to be new altogether? My example, with this I'll finish my answer to you. My example that I think people should take seriously is this. Until 1965, all the intelligent people in the world thought the world has no beginning. All the philosophers and all the scientists thought the world has no beginning. On scientific grounds, Newton was very famous, was very religious, some particular sect of Christianity. He may have believed in the creation, but not scientifically. There was no scientific reason for it. I imagine a Jew, let's say 1922, and he's a believing Jew. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. His cousin, who's been to university, says to him, really? You believe that? Do you know? That's just, beyond taking seriously. The whole world knows it has no beginning. Aristotle said so, and modern science follows it the same way, and we have vast experiments, we have theories that explain everything, and it's just not so. He thinks, really? I wonder. He goes on, looks up some of the literature, and reads some of it, and by golly, there's nobody out there saying there was a creation. Everybody says the universe has no beginning. He's struggling with his ancestral faith and his family and everything else. And by 1960s, really, he's just, can't hold on to it anymore. 1962, he starts eating cheeseburgers, and going scuba diving on Shabbos and so on. And he dies in 1964. 1 year before they discover that it was all wrong. They discovered the Big Bang in 1965. He just didn't live long enough. He gave up everything because that's what all the smart people say. And it just turned out to be dead wrong.
Something
Pretty gigantic. Everybody's convinced on the strongest scientific grounds the world has no beginning, and it has a beginning. Thank you. So if you can be wrong about that, why should you struggle because Max Tegmark at Harvard writes his incomprehensible book about the world is really mathematical. My field was philosophy of mathematics. Thank you. I read his book and I know I know what he says. It's not even a starter. How would you answer Max Tegmark? Thank you. I wouldn't bother to try because it isn't taken seriously now, and certainly in 10 years it won't be taken seriously. So
the only thing that kind of occurred to me, so I like that answer. It's like past of these challenges have been just dealt with, so therefore you can kind of anticipate future ones might be. As a way to like anticipate future ones, I think they all kind of fall into the category of you need a middle-sized entity between us and Hashem, because Hashem is kind of like an end-limit case. The way we describe him, I know we don't really describe him literally, but whatever it is, we say that he's the furthest thing that can be, in a sense. And so if you're saying that he's being impersonated, that you have a middle case of an entity that's powerful enough to sell that impersonation, but is somehow not scared that that being actually exists, or is like not in any way cognizant of that kind of threat or something. That's the only thing that occurred to me as like a way to say that that wouldn't be the smartest move on their part.
I have to think about it. It's very general terms, but what you're saying now is interesting. Idea of the structure is interesting. I have to think about it.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Listen, this is Q&A, guys. So if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. And if you don't, we can pack it up and do something else. Yeah?
Thank you, Rabbi. What was the takana that music was now forbidden since the korban of the Beis Hamikdash, and where does it apply today?
Look, so first of all, let me tell you about my background. My background is in philosophy and somewhat in science, and I've done that both secularly and in Torah as well. So those are the kinds of questions that I'm really trained to answer. Straightforward legal questions is not something that I have studied in detail.
Okay.
I do know that certain types of music are controversial before the kind of destruction of the temple, and that is putting verses of the scriptures to music is controversial. Certainly for popular song. Although there was music in the temple, and some of the music went together with the Psalms. When you say of a psalm, Mizmor Shir, the word shir in Hebrew means poetry. So does shira mean poetry. Mizmor means music. So Mizmor Shir or Shir Mizmor means you have a composition that has both words and music. But for popular use, there are those who say that no verses can be sung to music, and others say differently. The Talmud does say that when the temple was destroyed, people proposed adopting radical measures to express their grief, and then a certain dialogue took place. Well, we shouldn't eat meat because the meat was used as the sacrifice in the temple, and we want to mourn over the fact that we don't have it, so we shouldn't eat meat. So they said, okay, so you don't want to eat meat because of that. How about wine? Wine was used for this in the temple also. So you shouldn't drink wine. Okay. What about grains? Grain offerings were also used in the temple. Give up grains also? Okay. What about water? Were water libations on the altar? Going to give up water also? You know, I mean, where are you going to stop? How are you going to survive? And then the second argument was the further you are removed from a historical event, the less you experience it, and therefore keeping up the most stringent mourning for the temple just isn't practical. In fact, they point out that the strictures of mourning for the temple that you find in the Talmud are mourning for the destruction of the second temple, not for the destruction of the first temple. First temple was much greater than the second temple. It had the ark with the tablets. It had God's presence manifest. Miracles took place in the first temple. Why don't we have mourning for the first temple? The answer is because it's 500 years earlier. It's something that we can't relate to because of the distance of time. So as we became further and further removed from the destruction of the second temple, also the pressure for expressing the mourning became simply impractical. You don't want to pretend to feel and act as if you feel something when you don't. We're not into pretense. So for us, it has been reduced to the 3 weeks in the summer, which lead up to Tisha B'Av, where we commemorate the destruction of the temple, and also certain fast days during the year, 4 other fast days during the year. And that's what it's limited to. But that's not a lot of detail. You could ask somebody else to get more detail. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding Adam HaRishon. After he sinned by eating the tree, I think before he ate from the tree, that things were in the world were a little bit different of how they were supposed to be for the rest of the time. And when he ate from the tree, things changed. One of them being that the hara was one of the biggest challenges of man. And the question, it's kind of an open-ended question, but what's something that we should keep in mind when we want to rectify the sin of Adam HaRishon? So each person has to deal with the hara today. And what's something that we can keep in mind when trying to beat the hara?
Okay, really you're operating on 2 different levels. There's my level of my yetzer hara and what it induces me to do, which are failures on my part. And then there's rectifying the sin of Adam. That's a very grandiose project. We say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob worked on that, and it made a great contribution to that. We don't say anybody else did. So I think that undertaking a corrective for the sin of Adam is just not on our level that we should take seriously. Though, if you analyze what he did wrong, and of course there are many different analyses, you can learn something about it. You can learn something about the human tendencies that led to it, and each one of us in his own small way could try to improve in those particular tendencies, without thinking, as I said, of the grandiose project of correcting that for the whole of the creation. Dessler has an essay explaining what the test was for Adam HaRishon and how he failed. I know this in the Hebrew edition of Michtav Elio. It's the 2nd volume. I suppose in the English Strive for Truth, it's the 3rd volume or the 4th volume. He has essays on the various parshos. Not every one of them, but he has many. So the one on the first parsha, he describes Adam HaRishon's dilemma in the following way. He's told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Now, before he ate from the tree of knowledge, you can't say he had no yetzer hara, no evil inclination. Without evil inclination, you don't have free will. Though people say that, but they can't mean what they say because you have no free will otherwise. One way to describe how he was different from us is that he could not perform a transgression deliberately. The only way in which he could fail is to rationalize that what he's doing is right. The failure could be that the rationalization is false and that he should have known better. But if he knew that something was wrong, he couldn't do it. We, being the descendants of the ones who ate from the tree of knowledge, we have internalized the yetzer to the point where we can consciously and deliberately rebel and do something wrong. He wasn't in that position. He could only do something if he could rationalize it as right. So here, says Rav Dessler, was his rationalization. Yes, God told me not to eat from the tree. Now let's suppose I do what God told me. Well, in my present state of being, I can't do something deliberately wrong. I can't. Okay, God told me not to eat from the tree. I'm not going to eat from it because I can't do something that's deliberately wrong. So it's almost like I'm a robot. It's almost as if I'm being compelled. What kind of glorification of God's name will it be if I follow his rule when I'm in a condition where I can't rebel against the rule? Won't that make the glorification of God's name, which I'm supposed to be creating in the world trivial? Wouldn't it be a much greater glorification of God's name if I were able to deliberately disobey and then decide to obey? Wouldn't that be a much greater sanctification of God's name in the world? It would. Now, Rav Dessa says, you'll tell me, okay, it would. You can have fun speculating, but God said no. Yeah, that's true. God said no. But Adam knew how the Torah works. He knew the Torah's principles. And there is a principle called hara. Hara means that a court can decree that something should be done against the law, breaking the law, violating the mitzvah, if, by doing so, you bring about a greater sanctification of God's name. That flexibility is built into the Torah system. So, for example, the Gemara gives two examples of this. There was a man who rode a horse on Shabbos in public, and the court killed him. Riding a horse on Shabbos is not a malacha that the Torah prohibits, prohibited by the rabbis. But since he did it in public, and the effect on the population would be to decrease their appreciation of what Shabbos is, and their honor, and their awe of Shabbos, so they decided to make an example out of him and kill him, even though the law doesn't say he should be killed.
Was he warned?
I assume he was warned. I mean, although if he did it, there could be the implicit. Since you asked, let me just put another foot in. There's a footnote on a footnote, but here we go. People want to know, why should a person be executed for violating Shabbos? Wow, if it's murder or if it's idol worship, okay, I hear that. Those are very, very serious crimes. Shabbos, for violating Shabbos, you're going to execute him? Well, the truth is that you don't execute someone for violating Shabbos. Here, I'll give you an example. Here's Ruvain. It's Saturday afternoon, and he's about to light up a cigarette. Shimon and Levi come around the corner and say, Ruvain, it's Shabbos. You're going to die. Now, if Ruvain wants a cigarette, what should he say? He should say, oh, gosh, I completely forgot. Thanks, guys. You saved me from a terrible sin. Have a nice day. And when they walk around the corner, he'll light up a cigarette and smoke a cigarette. That's what he'll do if he wants to smoke a cigarette. But if he says to them, yeah, I know, watch, in your face, and he does it, does he want the cigarette? No, he wants a public anti-Torah demonstration. That's what he wants. That's what he dies for. It's not the same as breaking Shabbos. All the commandments except one, where you try to convince somebody to worship an idol, all of them require warning, and he has to respond, I know and I'm doing it anyway, and then what you kill him for is this brazen public violation of the Torah, not the simple transgression itself. Now this guy who's riding the horse may have, he may be waving the flag, Shabbos is silly flag. Like in some modern movements where they have their own flags and they wave them, I didn't say anything, that. Okay. So now they did that. Another man had relations with his wife in public. They gave him a beating. There's no transgression that requires lashes, but that kind of public display of lack of sanctity in the marital union, a lack of appreciation for the spiritual nature of man and behaving like an animal, that had such a terrible social effect that they gave him this punishment, even though the law doesn't prescribe it. So Adam HaRishon said, I know that God told me not to eat from the tree. I also know God communicated to me that Jewish law operates with the principle of Rosh Hashanah. So I think that what God means is this. He told me not to eat. He expects me to use Rosh Hashanah to eat once. When I eat once, I then internalize the yetzer to the point where I could purposely, deliberately violate the Torah, and then not violate the Torah to create a greater sanctification of his name. That's all included in what he communicated to me, and that's what he wants. No, you get that far in Rav Dessler's essay, and you think, yeah, that's pretty clever. Seems to work, No obvious mistakes there. So where was his failure? Now, Rav Dessler, being a Baal Musar, among other things, he knew the whole tradition, and a philosopher, put it this way. In order for this to work, your motivation has to be what you say it is. Now, he portrayed to himself his motivation this way. If I simply don't eat from the tree, then the sanctification of God's name in the world will be trivial. The world's purpose won't be satisfied. If I make myself capable of eating deliberately, and then I don't eat deliberately, then the sanctification of God's name in the world will be much, much greater, and that's what Hara is built for, to create a greater sanctification of God's name in the world. That's the way he portrayed his own motivation to himself. But it wasn't true. What was really driving him was, if I don't eat from the tree because God told me not to and I can't do otherwise, then I am trivial. My contribution is nothing. I've accomplished nothing. It's my triviality that was driving him. Not the triviality of the effect vis-a-vis God, but my contribution to the effect. It was really his own sense of insignificance. And that was the test. The test was to sacrifice his own sense of significance or insignificance, to sacrifice that to what God said should be done. So it'll be trivial. So what? So what? That's what he said should be done. I completely submit myself to what he said should be done. So you have here a kind of ego, but not the ego of money, and not the ego of power, and not the ego of fame, but the ego of spirituality. I want to be significant spiritually. Even that's ego. And Adam, on his level, the challenge was to see that that's where his motivation was coming from. He didn't. He rationalized it as his caring for God's place in the world, and really what it was his place for his place in the world. Okay, that's Adam on a level that's beyond our capacity. But we also struggle with ego, and sometimes we struggle with a spiritual ego. There's sometimes when we are motivated not by the needs of the outcome, but by our place in producing the outcome. And that we could learn on our own little level to try to work. I'll give you a practical example where this can happen to people. My guess is that it has happened to people. Reuven is working on his hospitality. And he's made up his mind that if Friday night in shul he sees someone who's not part of the community, that after davening he'll go over to him and he'll invite him because he wants to work on his hospitality. Okay. Then he comes to Ma'ariv, he says, Baruch Hu. He says, Baruch Hu, sits down, and then he sees him. Oh, there he is, over in the corner. Yeah, he's definitely not part of our community. Never seen him before. Right after davening, I'm going to go over and invite him. Good, he's ready. They sing Adon Olam, gets up from his seat, turns towards the corner, and he sees Shimon. Shimon is 2 steps ahead of him. He's walking towards the corner. Couldn't be that Shimon's going to invite him, could it? Oh no. I mean, it's my mitzvah, my hospitality. And Shimon goes over and he says, hello, who are you? You're out of town. Would you like a place to stay? Oh, yes, thank you very much. The two of them walk off. How do I feel? I'm devastated. There went my mitzvah. Okay. Now let's ask. What's God's point of view on this? Well, the stranger got his hospitality. Shimon got a mitzvah. And Reuven got the credit because he wanted to do the mitzvah. From God's point of view, it's win-win-win. So Reuven has to ask himself, if from God's point of view it's win-win-win, why am I unhappy? Because I'm not thinking about God's point of view. I'm thinking about my point of view. What's my point of view? It was my mitzvah. It was my mitzvah. Ego. That's spiritual ego. He doesn't want money, doesn't want power, doesn't want fame. He wants a mitzvah. Right. You have to subtract the ego from the mitzvah also. So here's a little case in miniature where he's facing a problem similar to what Adam faced, and then learning the fact that what Adam went through, he could say, okay, I have to be aware of my own spiritual ego. Yeah.
So we know the mitzvah not to hate your brother in your heart. So how should we think about all the Jews, and despite maybe seeing someone do something that you might not enjoy, or even just general feeling of how it's perhaps towards our other Jews.
A second. No, one second. I have an insulin pump here, and I've got to calibrate it. It'll take me a minute. Where am I up to? About 160. Okay. Okay.
I can actually ask a different question. Are
Okay.
we responsible for our thoughts? That's
Okay, let's start with that. We're responsible for our thoughts. So the natural feeling is things occur to me. I don't know where they come from. I certainly can't predict what I'm going to think of. I could be responsible for responding to the thought in one way or another, to push it out of my mind or to use it in certain ways. But I'm certainly not responsible for the thoughts occurring to me, because I don't do that. That's not quite right. Because although I don't choose what thoughts will occur to me, I can choose a course of action which will affect what thoughts will occur to me. If you are playing football with a bunch of friends, you're not likely to think about the stock market. You're not likely to think about supper. When you're competing, your mind is fastened on the competition. You're very unlikely to be distracted. When you learn Bechavusa, and that's a competition, because he reads the text, explains it, and you shoot him down, and tomorrow you reverse roles, so you're very unlikely to be distracted. So you can control what thoughts occur to you by filling your mind with certain particular thoughts so that you won't be distracted by other thoughts. That you can do. Will it work all the time? No. And when something occurs to you, is it guaranteed that you'll be able to deal with it? No. But there is something you can do about it. Your environment determines to a great extent what thoughts occur to you. If you're living in a yeshiva, it's one thing, and if you're living on the street, it's something else. So I don't think it's completely foreign. And there are rules for thoughts, and there are rules for emotions. So if the Torah gave us rules, that means it's crediting us with the ability to manage them somehow. Usually the management is indirect, but so what? You do it indirectly. Now, not hating your brother, and you quoted it right, so the comment of the oral tradition there is achicha b'mitzvos. Doesn't mean that every naturally born Jew or every convert. There's a difference of opinion among Rishonim whether it's appropriate to hate Jews or to hate their actions. And there are two views. King David said, Sanecha Hashem esna, those who hate you, I hate. Could you teach it as his actions? You could, but the words also include the meaning that you hate the person. So I don't think you have to think of this as a universal rule, but you have to be very careful to fill in the appropriate circumstances when you decide how you should feel about somebody. Almost always, the things that people do, they do because of some kind of failure or mistake, some kind of pain that they're under, or pressure they're under, or mistake that they're doing. The fact that a person does something doesn't mean he doesn't regret it. Talk to an addict. Right? They do these things, they're not proud of them. And some of them actively seek help to try to free themselves from the addiction. So the fact that you see somebody do something, it doesn't mean that he's happy or proud or satisfied with what he's doing. And if he isn't, and if he's trying to change his behavior, I think it would be unnatural to hate him. You simply have to have pity for her. So the goal is to, if there's going to be hatred at all, it's going to be very carefully researched as to whether this is an appropriate place for it. Other people, where their interactions with you may lead you to hate them, that you have to be very, very careful about it. There are two verses which on the surface are contradictory, and they make exactly this point. One is, bin pol oivecha al tismach, when your enemy falls, don't rejoice. And the other is, bavod b'shoirina, when the wicked are destroyed, there is joy. So the simple explanation is that there's a big difference between your enemy on the one hand and the wicked on the other hand. Why is he your enemy? If he's your enemy because he's wicked and you're representing God in the world, okay, that's one thing. But if he's your enemy because he did something that you don't like, and he may not be wicked, then don't rejoice when he goes down. When the wicked go down, you can rejoice. But not when he goes down just because he's your enemy. There would be the prohibition against hating him in your heart, because he's not really wicked. Yeah.
Just popped into my mind. We have, there are other planets in the solar system. I figure that's a good question. And it was never mentioned in the Torah. How are we supposed to understand the expanse of the universe if the Torah was given to us specifically living on this planet?
Why go to other planets? What about the deep sea creatures, and what about the ice caps at the poles, and what about the great deserts and so on and so on? I mean, we live in an environment. The environment controls the circumstances under which we live, the weather and the rest. And Kosh Baruch Hu told us how he wants to live in this world. We don't expect that, at least on the level of open shot, that the Torah is a complete account of all of the details of the world. 30,000 species of beetles. The animals get 3 words in one verse. God created the animals. Okay, on to the next subject. So we're not worried about the fact that these things aren't mentioned, and other worlds aren't any different from other aspects of our world that we don't know well, we don't inhabit, we only have effects of them indirectly. If you ask what use is there to the expanse of the universe, so there are answers on different levels. Rav Dester, I mentioned before, gives a Musar answer. You look around, even on this earth, and certainly when you look at the universe as a whole, now what I'm going to say, you may agree or disagree with it depending upon your politics and how well educated you are. But the fact is, there's more than enough of everything. More than enough air, more than enough space, more than enough resources, and more than enough of everything. No, we're not running out. Malthus was wrong. We're not 2 years away from universal starvation. I know certain people said that. They've been saying it since the 50s, and they've been wrong every time. So, the lesson says, Rav Dester, is if you don't have, it's not because God ran out. If you don't have, it's because he decided that you shouldn't have. That's one thing to think of. Then in more straightforwardly scientific terms, you tell somebody 300 years ago, I went sailing in this ocean, and guess what? The plankton is dying off. Great. The ships will sail through with less friction. They retard the ship's hulls, and we go smoothing on the sail. It will go quicker, it'll go faster, we'll have more trade. The food chain, they hadn't heard of that. There's no plankton, there's no fish, there's no, and then there's the whole food chain could collapse. But they didn't know the things were related that way. Oh, they didn't know they were related that way. Could there be other things that we don't know how they're related? Could that be? Is that possible? Maybe. And then maybe the things in the universe have an effect that we don't know. Now, Newton, one of the great things that Newton did, he did many, was to think of an experiment, a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, with which he wanted to prove something fundamental. He wanted to prove that space and time are absolute, not relative. not relative. And here's the experiment. He said, imagine a giant pail, half full of water. And the handle of the pail is tied to a rope, which is tied to a tree or something. And you wind it up so that when you let go, the pail is going to spin. Now you're sitting on the rim of the pail, and you look up. Well, gosh, things are moving around. But motion, you think, is relative. It's my position with respect, let's say, to the stars that's changing all the time. Should I say I'm moving and they're stationary, or they're moving and I'm stationary? Motion is relative. Just my position with respect to them is changing. That's as long as you look up. Now Newton says, look down. What are you going to see in the pail? You're going to see the water creeping up the side of the pail because of some centrifugal motion, right? Centrifugal power, force, right? Then you know that you're moving. Must be you that are rotating. That's what pulls the water up the sides of the pail, right? Therefore, he said this motion is absolute. It's not just relative. Not just that I'm changing my position with respect to something else. I'm really moving because you see the water going up the sides of the pail. That was his experiment. He believed in absolute times and absolute space, not relative, and that was one of his reasons for believing it. Okay, for a couple of hundred years, that was convincing. Along in the 19th century, along came Clerk Maxwell, and he said, no, I think that if the fixed stars were spinning, the fixed stars spinning would pull the water up of the pail. Not necessarily that the pail is moving. It's only the relative motion of the pail and the fixed stars that makes the water go up the sides of the pail, which means local motion effects, inertial effects on this planet are affected by the sum total of all the stars in the universe. That's a bit surprising. Oh, they're just out there, right? Who needs them? Let them all disappear. No, ping pong won't go. Ping pong balls won't go without the stars. Wow, that was Maxwell's answer to Newton's. Now, the question has been asked, in Einstein's theory, does Maxwell's principle apply or not? And you can't get a clear answer. At least when I checked, they weren't sure whether it's built in or it isn't built in. But that's like discovering that all those stars contribute to playing ping pong. You never dreamt of that. If somebody says, who needs all that stuff, it's all extra, could maybe just betraying our collective ignorance of how the world works. So I think you have to have a little, how should I say, a little distance from these kinds of questions to think that they have to have an answer. If you don't have an answer, that somehow you can draw a conclusion about it. The world is still a very, very poorly understood place. There are holes in our understanding all over. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on the discussion before on the mechanics of sin and the temptation to sin that we discussed before.
Adam said?
We're talking about how the mechanics of sin and how it works now.
All I gave was an example of the kind of failure that he was guilty of, and how we could apply it to something that's practical in our lives. So what is it that you don't understand?
So I wanted to know, from now, we know that there's an endpoint to some sort of endpoint to the yetzer hara. When Mashiach comes, it'll be diminished to an extent, or whatever that means, that our desire to sin will be diminished to an extent. From now until then, is it the same level of yetzer hara that we've always had? Or is it still growing in the sense that he knows that it's going to be, he's trying to make it harder and harder for us to get rid of it until Mashiach?
I don't think there's anything to be called what we've always had. It's always been different. It's always been changing. Different people have different types of yetzer hara. The same person has different type of yetzer hara in different periods of his life. It can affect his attraction to physical pleasure, or his pride, or his aggressiveness, or his fears, or his laziness, and it'll be different at different times. I don't think you can make comparisons like that. I think that the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs our lives, gerrymanders the circumstances under which we find ourselves, is to produce specific challenges at specific times, which are the next step in the progress that he wants us to make. So I don't think that comparisons like that are possible to make.
Generation by generation, there's no increase in the...
Well, there may be, and there may be increase, maybe decrease, but then, increase is only possible if you have a scale and you have a particular quantity that you're talking about. Increase of what? But, if you are comparing two objects, and you have to take into account surface area, volume, density, color, and ownership, which is greater than which? If you got 7 dimensions like that, there's no way to compare them, there's no way to add them up, so there's no way to make a comparison like that. It's just too many features to simply compare and say this is bigger than that. So I don't think we have the conceptual structure to ask a question like that. We could talk about in a specific area. What are you risking? What are your challenges? And then every person's circumstances are different. Two people may be confronted by war, but one has a certain inherent courage, and the other doesn't. So the external circumstances of war don't affect them in the same way. So I don't think you can make objective statements about differences like that. Yeah.
There's an expression that we have that I saw you at Sinai. That's an expression that we say.
Yeah.
So that's referring to that every Jewish neshama was at Sinai.
Yeah.
But there's 15 million of us now, however many Jews there are in the world, and there was only, not only, but there were 600,000 strong Yidden at Sinai. How do you understand the spiritual?
Yeah, I'll explain to you a little bit. There's one of the volumes of the Kisvei Arizal is Sefer Gilgulim, Gilgul, which is reincarnation. The neshama, like everything else, is divided into parts. And one division that you have throughout the entire creation is division into 10 parts. There's also division of 613 parts, and there's 7 parts, and all sorts of divisions. It's a very complicated system. But let's just take 10. Now, the Arizal says like this. You go through life, and your hope is to, by your actions, realize the potential of your soul. The soul has different aspects, different parts. Your lifetime could realize the potential of some parts and not other parts. So let's say out of the 10, you realize the potential of all except 1, 4, and 9. Says the Arizal, we don't take a chance, something that's been perfected, that it should be damaged. All of the others are taken out of circulation. And 1, 4, and 9 come back individually. You'll tell me, but wait a second. A soul that has 10 parts, an isolated part of the soul isn't a soul. How can it animate a body? The answer is everything subdivides into the same structure. So if I have 1, 4, and 9, 4 is 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5, 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, 4.10. 4 itself contains within it a sub-10. And 4.6 contains within it a sub-10. 4.6.1, 4.6.2, 4.6.3. It infinitely subdivides. So from 1, you could get 3 reincarnations. From 3, you could get 9 more reincarnations. The population can expand in that way. That's one. And the fact is, this traces back all the way to Adam, because we're all offshoots of Adam. So he contained within him what you could call a world soul. That is to say, his soul contains within him the totality of all mankind, and then we are just articulations of aspects of his soul. Actually, these kinds of deep metaphysical ideas you'll find in Midrashim, but Midrashim don't spell it out in metaphysical terms. It says one person is like Adam's toe, and one person is like Adam's eye, and one person's the Sanhedrin is called Einei Ha'eda, the eyes of the congregation. The king is called Lev Ha'am, the heart of the people. These are not just poetry. It is poetry, but it's not just poetry. The collectivity has different aspects, and they go back to Adam, who contained the whole of the collectivity. So this multiplication is built in.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I have to go and teach upstairs. So very good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.